Angela come and talk to us about domestic violence. Just one reminder that the Striper 5 is going right now to end this month, so make sure you get that turned in for your points. And I will turn the time over to them, but I do have the roll bell passed around to them.
Thank you guys for letting us come and present. We're really excited. For those who don't know, I know a few people in the room. My name is Michael Scott, and I work at the New Hope Crisis Center. I'm a victim advocate. I've been there almost 8 years. Mostly I work in the Justice Court with Judge Christensen in his courtroom, helping victims of domestic violence and sexual assault.
I'm Angela Byington. I'm actually the newbie at the Crisis Center. I've been there for about 1.5 years now, and I am one of the victim advocates, and then I'm also the Children's Services Coordinator.
So today we're talking about domestic violence. A couple of things we always like to talk about first are healthy relationships for both partners. You have open communication, what you like, what you don't like. You give each other space. I know sometimes you get in an argument, you're just like, I need 5 minutes. And you respect boundaries, both with sex, birth control, anything that you have going on. And you're supportive of differences. My fiance and I are so very different. He's like an outdoorsy person, and I would just like to stay inside and never go outside. But we respect that and honor those differences that we have. Domestic violence from a historical perspective is one person using power and control to dominate another person. They do this through fear, and they gain power over that person. It doesn't always have to be physical, but they do use physical and sexual violence, threats. Emotional abuse is actually a really big one we see a lot of, where they just use the threat of physical violence and make the person feel really small so that person doesn't ever feel like they're worthy to have a better relationship. They also, financial control. We see a lot of this in our elderly population, where other family members are coming in and controlling the finances, and they use that as a way to abuse the other person. Legal status. Something we've worked a lot with is women who actually have a legal status with neighbors, so that if they were to go to law enforcement, they don't have any proof that their status is actually legal. Harassment and stalking are some of the other ones. What this all does is it breaks down the support center. I know you've all probably seen on TV how they isolate, they keep you away from your family and your friends, so that the only support you have is that one person. They also alienate from coworkers and jobs. They'll actually go to your job and like sit there and wait for you to take you to work and get off work. Not just like, we have one car and we have to drive together, but they're waiting for you to make sure they see who you're talking to. They'll sit outside for a couple hours during the day just to see what you're doing. That's the number for the National Domestic Hotline. We also have a local number where you can dial 877-723-5600. And that information is in our pamphlets if you or someone you know needs help with domestic violence. I apologize, I forgot to warn you guys. These videos we show are a little bit shocking, and they can trigger some very strong emotions and responses. We have 2 more, so I apologize for not warning you beforehand. Oh. I want to watch it again. So some of the things we like to talk about are some of the myths and facts about domestic violence. The number one myth is that victims of domestic violence have a psychological disorder. The truth is that this characterized as women as having, or men, because we do work with men too, as mentally ill, stems from this that if you're staying in the relationship, you have to be sick in the head, or you wouldn't stand for it. You would just up and leave. It's not always that simple. More recently, the studies have shown that the people who stay in these relationships, they don't start out abusive. Like I always say, if they hit you on the first date or abusive on the first date, you wouldn't have gone out on a second date. So they start out slowly and slowly over time. The violence gets worse and worse and worse, and by the time it's to the point where there's bruises and also, and physical attacks, the victim's been there so long, and she or he feels that they don't have anywhere else to go, and they deserve it. It's not a mental illness. That person has made them feel that way. The second one is the low self-esteem. That's why they get into these relationships. There's little support for the theory that low self-esteem causes victims to become involved in abusive relationships. Like I said, some victims, you start to experience lower and lower self-esteem the longer you stay there, because you think this is what you deserve, that you're not worth anything better, so you don't ever leave. Batterers abuse their partners or spouse because of alcohol or drug abuse. And while there is a strong correlation between domestic violence and alcohol and drug abuse, that's not the only reason. Usually the violence gets worse because of alcohol and drugs, but it's still continuing when there's not alcohol and drugs in the home. When you're drinking and you're high, your emotions are, as we all know, get out of control, and you're more likely to lose the control, but you're still being abusive before you're getting drunk or high. So, the myth that DV is only physical abuse, like we said, there's sexual, financial, emotional abuse that occurs with it. That it's a momentary lapse in temper, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And it's easy to end. Victims can walk away from the relationship at any time. Victims stay in the relationship for a variety of reasons. It could be, fear of leaving. It's a fact that most times when you leave your relationship, it's the worst and most dangerous time for a woman, especially for women. You're more likely killed when you leave than if you stay and try and diffuse the situation. They can stay because of financial reasons. He's taken away all your way to make money, so you stay in the relationship because you might have kids and you don't know how to support yourself outside of the relationship. And the other big one is family. We call them the 3 F's. Fear, financial, and family. You created a life with this person, and you still want to try and make it work in some way. You think that maybe if you're better, or if you just get therapy or counseling, or if everything's perfect, the violence will stop. You want to hand those out? So this is what we call the cycle of abuse. And this is a very simplistic form. We both love and hate the cycle of abuse. But it basically breaks it down. You have the tension building. This is where you might have minor pushing and shoving, but not a big physical blow up. And a lot of emotional abuse is occurring at this time. Being in that relationship, you can feel that tension coming. You know it's coming. You know how his reactions or her reactions are going to be. So you try and control it by doing everything as perfect as possible to stop the situation. You try and just have dinner ready. You try and please the person. You try to make everything perfect so to avoid the violence. And victims also often report that they're walking on eggshells during this time. However, we all know that we can't control somebody else. We're responsible for our own actions. So the victim can't control the abuser. This is actually the longest phase. This can last anywhere from like a day to months and months, and even in some cases years, where they're just constantly walking on eggshells trying to make this relationship not have a big blow up. Then you have, I touched the screen. You have a blow up where there's an explosion. Go back. Okay. Sorry. The actual abuse happens. This can be physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, or financial. Where you have, the big incident that happens. Then you have where your abuser feels sorry and apologetic. They make promises. This is where they bring flowers. I'm never going to do it again. Let's go to therapy and fix this problem. I love you so much. During this phase, victims will tell you that nobody has ever loved them as much as their abuser during the honeymoon phase, because they're trying to make up for whatever happened in the explosion So they're like very all-encompassing and loving. And this is one of the things where victims stay because they think, oh, he can get better. Look, he's not always like this. He has these good moments. Or, she, isn't throwing things at me and dishes and yelling at me. So they think that they can stay because they have this really happy moment in life. But eventually we go back to the tension building. During this, they often are minimizing all the abuse that's happening. They'll say, well, this and this happened. And then a couple days later, they're like, well, I did this. I didn't have dinner on the table. I, upset her about, her spending. So a lot of times, once the explosion is reported, once we get to the honeymoon phase, they start denying how extreme the situation is. So here are some examples of different power and control. Perpetrators will use intimidation, making them feel ashamed, throwing things not at them but in their general direction. Destroying property, abusing pets, that's a big one, where they'll say, well, he will be mean to the dog. And when they say be mean to the dog, actually they kill the pets. A lot of the times to show them that they have this power over them. Then we have the emotional abuse of putting the person down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names. And then using the isolation, which is, isolating them from support groups. Minimizing, perpetrators are really good about minimizing and turning the blame back around onto whoever the victim is. Well, if you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have hit you. They'll use the children. They'll withhold the children. They have finances and, and jobs, so they'll say, well, if you leave me and we go to court, I'll get the kids because I have a job and you don't, so I can support the kids, so the court will give me the kids. This is something you see using male privilege. Because I'm the man, I get to make decisions, and you're the woman and you can't. Economic, withholding money, and they're just using coercion and threats to keep the person like, I'm going to commit suicide if you ever leave me. We hear that a lot in relationships. There's also society factors that keep people in relationships. We have tolerant and even encourage. In our society, unfortunately, men, and I love men, and I say this, and I have a lot of men in my life that I love that are awesome men, but they're taught to be strong. And if you're not a strong man and you can't lift these weights and open this jar and support your family, you're less of a man. So we breed into our men this oppressive and aggressive environment, and then we blame the victims for staying in the relationship at the same time. So we teach our men to be strong, and sometimes when they don't know how to do that in an appropriate way, it gets out of control. And then we blame our victims for for staying in the relationship and not leaving. The other one is it's not my business. You hear the stories about, well, she was killed and the neighbors heard all this screaming and yelling, but nobody ever called the cops because it was a family issue. It's not a society issue. Like I said, we have the men who are hyper-masculine and dominant, and women, we're supposed to be pretty and just, oh, look at us. And that's how our society has taught us to be. We also have power and control in our society with racism, sexism, classism. All of these things go to keep victims in these bad relationships. This is a really great quote that we have. The argument that boys will be boys actually carries the profound anti-male implication that we should expect bad behavior from boys and men. The assumption is that they are somehow not capable of acting appropriately or treating girls and women with respect. And we all know that's not true. So something that we always like to stress is your experience in your family community have shaped how you view the world and how you respond to things. I grew up in Box Elder County. How many other people did? So we all grew up in this county, but our experiences were vastly different even though we were here. But we do carry some of the same ideas and norms that come with growing up in this county. Think about some of the ways that gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, class have impacted on your life and how you view things that happen outside of it. So some of the things that get in our way of seeing why victims might be blamed or why they are not leaving is our own privilege. As a white girl living in Box Elder County, I have some privileges that go with that. And now I can't think of any. But, well, and I'm college educated too, so I have a lot of opportunities that are out there for me that someone else would not have, just because that's my privilege. There's injustices that are experienced by others because that's my privilege, and somebody else in the same county might not have the same opportunities or privileges that I have. So you always have to look at the whole situation. It's critical to understand that what might be happening in another person's world may not be happening in your world, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And the reason we bring all of this up is because there's oppression in our own communities that stop victims from seeking services and help perpetrators continue their power and control. We have things like technology, if you don't have access to it, courts, education, access to medicine, religion, that's a big one in our community. Just the government and social services, if you don't know how to access them. Your culture. What if your primary language isn't English, and so you're not sure of everything and how it works? We have social types. You have children and parents and clubs and groups and classmates. Then you have your family dynamics, like you have secrets in your family, child abuse and neglect and incest and mental illness. Then you have victim barriers like addiction or trauma. And we'll talk more about trauma and victims in a little bit. Education, social support, your sexuality. And then the batterer traits. How does your batterer treat you? Like they feel entitled or self-centered, possessive. All of these things are pushing down and helping perpetrators commit the crime, and the victims having a harder time to leave because they're not aware of it. And as a society, these are things that we need to be aware of and look at so that we can help protect the people. Okay, Cassandra. Put it on there.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about trauma. And victims can be anybody. Doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter if you're educated, doesn't matter where you live. You know, it really doesn't matter. Domestic violence happens everywhere, across every boundary you can think of. So those are the people who are going to survive. When we think about crisis affects everybody. It affects you, it affects me, it affects victims of domestic violence. The thing is, we don't all perceive it the same way, and so the way that we're going to react to it is going to be different also. And they are actually coming out with a lot of new research lately, and Rebecca Campbell is in charge of a lot of this that's coming out, and the difference is actually physical in our heads. Okay, the definition of trauma is pretty basic. It's an experience that creates a sense of fear, helplessness, horror, and overwhelms a person's resources for coping. So this can be a short-term effect, it can be a long-term effect, it can be debilitating, it can be, you know what, that's really not that big a deal, it's okay. It just really depends on the person as to how deeply that trauma is going to affect them. When we look at the body's reaction to this trauma, it's the autonomic nervous system. So it's the part of the body that's in the unconscious is what kicks in and takes over. So in doing this, the prefrontal cortex, which is the front of your brain, okay, that's where all your logic and reasoning is. Okay, the amygdala is back in the middle of your brain, and that's where all of your emotions are. Okay, those two centers of your brain cannot function at the same time. So if in a crisis, your emotional brain, the amygdala, is going to be very activated. Okay, so that means that the thinking and logical part of your brain is going to shut down. So if you've ever encountered victims who have a hard time remembering the memories, putting pieces together, putting it into a storyline, that's the reason why. Their brain was so focused on the details. They might be able to tell you the smell of the breath. They might be able to tell you the size of the barrel of the gun. You know, different things like that, those emotions, that fear, that's what's driving them. And it takes what they're saying now is it takes a couple of days. You need to have about 2 sleep cycles to actually have those pieces start to come together. I don't know if any of you have seen the presentation from Dr. Kelly from the Attorney General's office. Her visualization for this is she has a picture of a board, and it has all different colors of sticky notes all over, plastered, just random. Okay, this is what a victim's memory looks like after they've been through trauma. Every bit of memory they have from that event, there's one piece on this yellow sticky, there's one piece on this green one, there's one piece on this yellow one. And it takes time for them to be able to get those sticky notes to come back together and to be able to process that in a logical thinking fashion. So when we look at the chromatrisis response, those can be magnified through different parts of our body and our behavior. So physical, cognitive, emotional, spiritual, and behavioral. So now we're going to just look at some examples in each of those areas. So physical can be, aches in the body. It can be sweating, changes in sleep pattern, appetite, constipation, whether you're interested in sex, loud noises, getting a really bad cold. Okay, cognitive. So kind of we've already talked about, an impaired memory, you're disorganized. Something that a lot of victims feel is they're powerless. How did this happen? Trouble concentrating, poor attention span. Okay, emotional, that can really be all over the place. Shock and belief, anxiety, disorientation, hypervigilance, irritability, motion swings. You'll have somebody who's calm one minute, they're crying the next minute they're something is absolutely hysterical and you have no idea what it was. They're worrying, they can't quit thinking about it. That's all that goes through their mind, just over and over and over is that replay. Nightmares, flashbacks. Here's some more. Panic. An increased need to control everyday experiences. At this moment in their life, that's all they're feeling is out of control. Things that have happened to them that they had no control over. And so they're going to try to control every little tiny detail that they possibly can to get back to something that's normal. They're going to try and avoid anything that has to do with that trauma that they have just been a part of. A lot of times they'll isolate themselves, they'll feel shame, they'll feel guilt.
Step in for a second.
Yes.
Something that we have a lot at our office is that we help people get protective orders against their perpetrators. And as we're trying to get this story to figure out if they qualify for the protective orders, their stories are jumping all over. They'll tell us something that happened like 10 years ago, and then they'll tell us something that happened just like the other day, and it's all over the place. And so what we try and do is just try and get them, and it's not always easy, to focus on the most recent incident, and then we slowly go back and work with them and get them into therapy to help them to deal with anything. But they'll be right in the middle of their story, and they'll be like, oh, and then like 3 years ago, this also happened. You're like, okay. And you have to bring them back to the moment because they're so focused on this that their brain is just throwing all this stuff at them, saying, oh, you have to tell them this, you have to do this, you have to do this, you do this, and they get just stuck right there, and we have to bring them and help them focus on this incident so that we can help them get the help that they need.
Okay, so back as we look at spiritual, the world is unsafe. How can they trust those normal things that they've had their whole life? They don't want to be a part of humanity because it's out of control and it's scary. Is it worth living? They feel betrayed. Behavior, this kind of goes along with everything else. The fatigue, the hysteria, the crying, diminished activity. So the last statement here at the bottom of the screen is the most important. Basically, any reaction in a trauma situation is to be expected as normal for that person because everyone is going to react differently.
And those of you who are in law enforcement and have worked with victims, you've probably seen this when you're talking to people. You'll have just somebody whose story is all over the place. They'll be crying and then laughing, and then they'll be like angry and enraged at you and the system and everything like that. And these are all normal reactions because that primitive brain, which is like the size of a walnut, by the way, has taken over their entire brain, and they can't regulate themselves like they normally would be able to do so.
Okay, as we looked at that cycle before where it had the honeymoon phase and the tension building phase, we need to remember that it's not just that particular event. Domestic violence is ongoing. It's a daily thing. It is multiple things every single day. Okay, and it's not just, you know, if there's a family situation, it's not just that main victim. It's the children. It's the, you know, whoever else is involved in that family is experiencing that same violence. You know, and here it's calling it emotional terrorism. There is manipulations and controls and power that is going on all the time. It is not just the physical or the sexual. And it's harder because this is somebody they see. You know, it's a family member. They see that person every day, and it's somebody that they love. You know, especially if it's kids. This is mom. This is dad. This is, you know, aunt or uncle. And so you don't understand. You know, you pretty much grow up with, well, this must be normal because this is all I know. Here's some more examples. You know, the victim knows the person. So, you know, secrets are encouraged. The victim is never heard. They feel powerless. The reality is changed. The reality is whatever the abuser wants it to be. And he's going to shape that so that it fits whatever his agenda is. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of these behaviors that come about, there's also some strategies. Okay, victims are going to have strategies. You're going to try to get yourself back to normal, and you're going to use anything that is available to you or anything that you feel is going to be successful. So that can be anything from substance abuse to high-risk behavior, self-harm, disassociation, avoidance. Sometimes it's even continued contact with the abusive partner. This is something that we see on a regular basis. The statistic is it actually takes 7 times for the victim to leave before they actually leave for good. So they'll come and see us, we'll work with them for a while, and then they get back into that denial that we talked about. And, you know, it's like, oh, it really wasn't that bad. He really loves me. He, you know, those things. And so they'll go back.
There was a recent study done about the substance abuse, and it was done in women, and they went to jails and prisons, and women who were there because of drug charges of any kind. They started talking to them about their past. 70% of them were there because of past domestic violence or childhood sex abuse. So there's a real correlation between those two problems that we have in our society.
Okay, so none of these reactions are due to being weak. It's rather these victims are just trying to get back to normal after an abnormal event. So they might not be healthy, but for the survivor, they're helping them to feel like they're in control again. Okay, something that can be very harmful coming from society or, you know, anywhere is when we start saying, you know, victim blaming. Well, you've been in this situation before, you've left him before, why did you go back? You know, blaming that victim, you knew better. Why, you know, what were you thinking? You know, holding them responsible for all of these things is the wrong area to look. We need to be looking at the abusers. They're the ones that need to be held responsible. They're the ones that are committing these acts. And so by having this kind of attitude, have the victim feel this way, you know, it is their fault, that's going to make it really hard for advocates or for anybody else who's working with them to really be able to get through to help and support and get them to move on. So here it is. Here's the quote. The question is not, why didn't the victim leave? The better question is, why does the abuser choose to abuse? Okay, and Michael kind of talked about some of these. Some of the reasons for staying. They have kids together. They don't have a job. How are they going to support themselves? They have nowhere to go. They don't have any family close. They've been isolated, fear. They're afraid to be alone. They see that honeymoon phase. There is good in that person somewhere if they can just figure out how to bring that out. Faith, etc. We also know that abusive relationships escalate over time. And so one of our jobs as advocates is to try and safety plan with those victims. We go through the paperwork, we do the protective orders, we do the stalking injunctions and things like that. But they need to kind of have a safety plan, things to be aware of, things to watch for, maybe a different way of doing things to also help. Leaving. When the victim does decide to leave, this is the absolute most dangerous time for them, because that abuser is going to realize they are losing control, and they will do absolutely anything that they possibly can to get that control back. So if there happen to be guns in the home, that makes it even more dangerous. If there have been threats of suicide or homicide, this is going to also increase the risk of lethality. If they have left in the past, so this is their 7th time, they are out the door, that makes it even more dangerous. And also, we have to remember, if there is, if it's a family, those kids go back because it's dad. Having that visitation, that still leaves some issues there. That's going to constantly remind that abuser, hey, I don't have that situation I had anymore. Okay, domestic violence is a crime in all 50 states, and victims have rights. So, for us at the New Hope Crisis Center, this is just kind of a little bleep to remind you guys of what it is, so that you can pass that along to victims if there's any way that we can support them. So as an advocate, we provide immediate and long-term support for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other crimes against a person. Victims receive emotional support, information, community resources, help with protective orders, stalking injunctions, and assistance during court proceedings. Our center also has access to a 24-hour crisis shelter for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Victims are given choices so that they may make their own decisions.
And something important to remember is that by law, all of our services are confidential. So we cannot say whether someone has come to us and talked to us without them signing a written release. It's a federal law that we can't do that. So if you send someone to us and say, hey, did so-and-so show up? We'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about, yes or no. But at the same time, you can let other victims know that we're not going to be blabbing it to anybody. It's very confidential what happens, and what services we provide for you are between you and us and nobody else, unless you want us to let them know about it.
And everything that we do is free, and it's all inclusive. Doesn't matter who you are or what you're coming in for. Okay, in addition to this, we also have some classes that we like to offer the community. So we have support group, and that also comes with a children's group. So the parents and guardians that are attending support group will take and do some with the kids at the same time. Adult life skills, anger management. We have a free leave night once a month. We offer individual counseling sessions, and then community educational presentations.
I would like to point out that says women's support group is actually not a support group for DV victims. It's an old, but
sorry.
It used to just be for women. Over the last few years, we've evolved it to include men and women who are victims of domestic violence. So they are welcome to come with their children also.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about children. Research shows that 50% of men who frequently assault their wives also frequently abuse their children. Okay, how did we do that last time? Oh, there we go. Okay, that was pretty tough. This is one of the saddest things that we see when we have victims come in, is the children that they bring with them. These little kids, these are our future. They're the ones who are going to grow up. They're going to take the jobs. They're going to be the elected officials. They're going to be the law enforcement. They're going to take over. We can't do this forever. And, you know, we really need to be careful that we watch out and we protect these kids. There's no way around it. Wrong way. Okay. So, if you look at statistics, between 10 to 20% of children in the U.S. are exposed to domestic violence annually. That can be seeing, that can be hearing, that can be any number of things. This is our last one. Bear with us. This one's not an easy one either.
This is an actual 911 call that really happened.
have actually heard that whole call, but it's about 5 minutes long. And that little girl is screaming. The dad's been knocked out. The little girl is 5. She's screaming for the dad to quit hitting the mom. Please send the police. Please send the police. And it's actually really hard to listen to. So most of the time when children are exposed to DV, they're also at risk for abuse themselves, neglect, and obviously if they're going to hear and see this kind of stuff going on, trauma. Exposure to violence against mother influences children psychologically, cognitively, and they have found out long term. Okay, some of the psychological influences are depression, anxiety, suicide, higher levels of aggression, anger, hostility, oppositional behavior, and disobedience, fear, withdrawal, and low self-esteem. When you look at cognitive influences, it's lower functioning, poor school performance, lack of conflict resolution skills, limited problem solving, pro-violence attitudes, belief in rigid gender stereotypes, and male privilege. And long term, they're seeing a lot of adult depression and trauma symptoms and violence in their own adult relationships. They're taking these examples, these models, and they think that that's normal. In a class that I took a couple years ago, we were discussing children, and at that point in time, I was kind of under the assumption, okay, the older kids are, the more they're going to see, the more they're going to hear, the more they're going to experience, the more detriment this is going to be on them. They're actually showing now, the younger the child is, the more detrimental it is, because it will actually alter structurally their developing brain. So these new infants that are in cribs in another room who are even just listening are going to have long-term structural changes to their brain.
What happens in the womb? They've shown that babies, when they're born to mothers who have had trauma, domestic violence trauma, have the same problems that children who witnessed it or heard it. So even as young as in the womb, 3 to 4 months, these children are hearing this, and it does affect their development inside the womb.
Children exposed to family violence show the same pattern of activity in their brains as soldiers exposed to combat, is what they are now being able to prove through research. One of the primary reasons that our victims will decide to make that final cut and to leave is to protect their children. However, the thought of visitation and having to leave those children with that abusive parent is terrifying, not only for the victim, but also for those children, especially if they were there and were experiencing those episodes and incidents that were going on.
We actually had a woman recently who finally came. We've been working with her on and off for years. She'd come to us for help, maybe stay at the shelter for a little while, and then she'd always go back to her abuser. And she said the only reason she did that for as long was because she was scared of her children having visitation with him by themselves. And she says she didn't ever report anything to law enforcement until the very last one, because she was so scared. And he had told her, well, I'm friends with everyone at the sheriff's department, so they're not going to believe your story, they're going to believe mine anyway. And she really believed that and didn't leave because she was so scared of what would happen. Because if she stayed and he was out of control, she could take the abuse herself and help protect the children. But if she's not there, there was no one there to protect the children.
One other thought, and something that we're seeing more and more of, is immigrant victims. You know, not just being women. I mean, of course, it can happen to men too. But when you look at this, whether they're legal, they're illegal, there's going to be cultural barriers, there's going to be language barriers. We have had a lady in, where was she from? Marshall Islands. We had a lady who came into shelter who was from the Marshall Islands. We didn't know how to communicate with her. Luckily, she had a family member who could come in and help us do that. You know, there's places outside of the U.S. are more afraid of authority, so just because they're now all of a sudden here in the U.S., they're not going to, you know, oh, it's okay, you know, we can call, we can get this backup, we can get help. They're going to bring all of those things with them. A lot of times, those abusers will, you know, say, hey, I'm going to get to keep the kids, you're going to get deported, you are never going to see those children again. They're going to be here with me. And when they're in that situation for so long, that's very real to them. They don't, you know, they feed them with these lies. They don't know what their options are. They don't know that there are people out there who can help them. So kind of a little final here to wrap things up, and then we can have a little discussion or questions for a minute. Just a word about words, okay? It's not our job to right wrongs. It's not our job but it is our job to treat all victims with respect and dignity. This means doing our best to be culturally aware of the differences and sensitive to what those differences might, you know, the effect they might have on those people. It starts with cultural competency, and it's something that we need to take a look at ourselves. You know, what kind of biases, what things did we grow up with? How do we think, you know, gender should act? What are role expectations? What are, you know, all of these different kinds of things, because that's where we're coming from in the first place. It also means that we do our best to meet victims where they are. You know, if we can tell that they're in trauma, we need to, you know, try to give them a second. You know, if we're going to ask them a question, give them a second to try and pull sticky notes and put those kind of things back together. That's a big thing that we do at our center. You know, we'll lay out all of these options. You know, it's like a Thanksgiving table, and the table's just full of all these opportunities and options for them. And, you know, but the thing that we have to remember is it's their choice. And we don't add any pressure. You know, whatever it is that they decide, we're going to help and support. The words that we use not only demonstrate our respect for others, they say a great deal about our own bias and our professionalism. So that is the end of the PowerPoint.
Do you guys have any questions or comments or anything? We do have some flyers that we're going to pass around, talk about our services and when they are. I have a one for here in the Sheriff's Department. This one is actually for law enforcement to give out to victims. It talks a lot about what's going on, victim services and how they can stay safe. There's actually a safety plan in this in case they don't want to talk to an advocate, they don't want to do much with it. It's for the officers. Okay, so here you go, and then they can help start building their own safety plan, even if they don't talk to us to help them do that. And I'm going to pass out these little bookmarks. They're really pretty, but there's a secret in them. Down here on the leaf is our phone number. It's very discreet. It's not something you're going to see, obviously. So if you know someone who needs help, you don't want to give them our card or brochure because that could be dangerous for them. Oh, look, here's a pretty bookmarker, and they know where the number is. And unless they point it out, it's not that easy to find.
And then as she's doing that, these brochures for our center here in Brigham, I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that in Garland there is a new community resource center. And we are one of the partner agencies that is there. And so there is this little blue flyer that is inside the brochure. And that kind of tells about what things that we have going on in Garland. At this point, we have an advocate there 1 day a week. As the need grows, we will make sure that we're there to cover that. And then we do have a support group that is there, and we do have adult life skills and teen life skills. So if you could help us get that information out to any victims who might be in need of that, we would really appreciate it.
Okay,
side, we would like to thank Angela and Michael for coming. And I'm sure they would hang out there for a few minutes. So if anybody wants to talk to them before you walk out the door, and make sure you sign the roll. I know it's floating around here somewhere.